Here's something that very few people know. Real bourbon can, in fact, be made outside of Kentucky. There's nothing in the law that says otherwise, yet 95% of all bourbon is made there. There's a very good reason that this is the case, though. Limestone, a civil war, and possibly a preacher who has nothing to do with any of this are all to blame. Now, if you ever have had a drink of bourbon and haven't questioned where the wonderful caramel flavor came from, be prepared to set that glass down and listen closely, because in the next 20 minutes, you're going to learn how the drink at the heart of America nearly failed thrice, was plagued by a taxation that caused farmers to go to war with themselves, was banned in the nation's very own drinking prohibition, and nearly lost to the Civil War in the process. So next time you hear someone talk or you read some fact that tells you how bourbon was really born, chances are they're lying to you. Maybe not intentionally, but it's very probable that the next thing to come out of their mouth will be a legend that is far more interesting than the boring truth. But that is why we're here. So let's begin, shall we? The story didn't start in Kentucky, and not even with the Americans. It started in the late 18th century when Scottish, Irish, and German settlers arrived on the eastern coast of the future United States. They brought with them know-how that had been developed in their homeland, where people had been distilling grain into strong liquor for centuries. But in the New World, there was no barley as in Europe. There was corn by the bushel. So the settlers took to using the local crop in their brews. And so, in Pennsylvania and Virginia, a tradition was born. Farms without a still were exceptional, as farmers found that they could not compete with the market price for whiskey. Hauling the grain to a town was both time and labor-intensive, and trying to sell it there fetched only a pittance for the effort. A bushel of grain could be turned into vastly more valuable whiskey, which could then be stored in barrels and transported with relative ease anywhere. Grain prices were notoriously volatile in colonial America, and the value of a bushel could drop by as much as 50% on the road. It made perfect economic sense to turn it into something more transportable and valuable. Another reason for the popularity of whiskey as a currency was the sheer lack of it in the Western colonies. The local economy relied heavily on whiskey as a medium of exchange, and settlers used it to pay taxes, as coins and paper money were in short supply. That is also when the story takes a turn toward the insane, which is why we are here today. In 1791, the young American government, under Hamilton's leadership, introduced a tax on liquor. The reasoning was simple: to pay off the national debt by imposing an excise duty on the distillation of alcohol. However, this decision had severe consequences for the people of the western part of Pennsylvania, because whiskey was their main source of income at the time. Moreover, most of them were small farmers for whom the grain produced on their farms was the only source of income. The excise affected them disproportionately in comparison with the large commercial distilleries of the East, whose owners had more resources to deal with new taxes. It is this tax that led to the famous Whiskey Rebellion several years later. Unwilling to pay the new tax, farmers violently resisted the federal authorities. In the western part of Pennsylvania, attacks on tax collectors and burning of the warehouses began. This rebellion grew so large that President Washington himself had to lead an army of about 13,000 soldiers to western Pennsylvania and put down the rebellion. It is noteworthy that despite the long struggle, the rebellion itself did not lead to the abolition of the tax. Nevertheless, the adverse effects of the whiskey tax were significant for the local distillers. Discontent with the introduction of the tax and unwilling to pay it, many small independent farmers left for the West, which was then the Wild West. On the outskirts of civilization, these pioneers built new distilleries following their entrepreneurial interest, not knowing that they were creating the foundation for a new business of a huge corporation. One of the most notable effects of the whiskey tax is that it was permanently repealed in 1802 as unfair and unnecessary by President Jefferson. However, the shift in the center of whiskey production had already occurred by then. There were not enough resources for the distillers who left to return to the east, so they remained in the west, in the future state of Kentucky. Consequently, it was in this state that the new generation of whiskey distillers and entrepreneurs, who became the pioneers of the local brand spirit industry, began their careers. Kentucky seems to have been created by nature itself to produce this drink. For example, there is an abundance of limestone underground, which filters out iron from groundwater that could make the drink bitter and cloudy, while enriching it with calcium, which would be needed for fermenting the corn mash, as it would be found out later. The locals had no idea about the science behind it. All they knew that the water produced a finer spirit than the one they used to make whiskey before. The second thing that contributed to the popularity of bourbon was the climate. Although it may seem unremarkable, the combination of hot summers and cold winters created the perfect environment for aging. The barrels containing the young bourbon underwent the process of expansion and contraction because of the drastic temperature differences, which allowed the spirit to breathe and absorb the sweet and woody flavor of the oak. This process could not have happened in the more moderate Scotland, where the creation of their own style of whiskey, Scotch, was taking place at the same time. Due to the mild climate, the process of aging there was significantly different. In the summer, the temperature in bourbon warehouses may reach over 40 degrees Celsius, while in the winter, it may get way below 0 degrees Celsius inside the warehouses. It means that a single barrel of whiskey undergoes dozens of expansion and contraction cycles per year. A lot of master distillers use this fact to their advantage by placing their barrels on the top floor of their warehouse where the temperature changes would be most extreme. However, the most surprising revelation about bourbon's history is not connected to the water or climate. In fact, it is about something really trivial: the barrels themselves. And this is where the conspiracy theory starts, while some researchers believe that the truth may be hidden by the bourbon industry leaders. The most widespread version of the charred barrel is associated with the Baptist preacher Elijah Craig. In the late 18th century, he accidentally burnt the interior of several barrels that he was supposed to use for storage. The preacher tried to use these barrels again to hold whiskey, and, according to the legend, the result was really impressive. Several months later, Craig received a barrel of liquid with a beautiful amber color and a delightful caramel taste, unlike anything he had tasted before. Nevertheless, there is reason to believe that Craig could not be the inventor of the charred barrel. First of all, historians trying to prove this theory's incorrectness have not found any documents certifying that Craig was the first to invent the charred barrel. Furthermore, even if the preacher was the first, he was probably not the first to come up with the idea of burning barrels to get rid of the smell. It was a common practice to burn wood to remove the odor of salted fish or tar that clung to the interior surface of the barrel. The charred wood acted as an amazing adsorbent and removed the unpleasant smell of tar or fish from the barrel. Perhaps sometime later, someone realized that the liquid stored in the charred barrel acquired a delightful caramel flavor. However, until recently, few people have tried to criticize the theory that Craig invented the charred barrel. This might be explained by the fact that the story with the charred barrel serves as a nice legend and provides a better promotion for brandy. First of all, even though it is hard to believe that Craig accidentally invented the charred barrel, the idea itself is so nice that many people would like to see him in the position of the creator of this great invention. Secondly, it is hard to imagine advertising dozens of distillers who accidentally invented the charred barrel. A single hero like a Baptist preacher is much more heroic for a slogan on a whiskey bottle. Nevertheless, it is crucial not to forget that every great advertising campaign is built on sand, and this might be the case with the invention of the charred barrel and the legacy of John Brown. There is one more reason for doubting the authenticity of the origin story of the charred barrel. One of the modern whiskey brands has decided to use the legend about Elijah Craig to promote their product, thus becoming the new owner of the myth about the bourbon whiskey. Most people who buy their product in a supermarket will not know the real story about the invention of the charred barrel and the legacy of John Brown. By the middle of the 19th century, The word bourbon had already been firmly associated with a type of whiskey made from corn and aged in charred oak barrels. Historians, however, have not been able to decide what the name actually refers to. According to one version, it comes from Bourbon County in Kentucky, which was named after the French royal family of Bourbon, as the French were among the first allies to recognize the independence of the U.S. According to another version, the name was derived from the Bourbon Street in New Orleans, as it was there that the whiskey was exported via the Mississippi River. It was in 1964 that the law officially recognized bourbon and its place in American history. As stated in the resolution adopted by the House of Representatives, bourbon is a distinctive type of American whiskey. From the resolution, it also follows that bourbon can only be produced in the U.S., where it is made from a mash of at least 51% corn, aged in new charred oak barrels, and not flavored or colored in any way. As you might have already understood, the truth about the name of the whiskey is also closely related to the initial assumptions stated at the beginning of this video. In the resolution, it is not stated that bourbon has to be made in Kentucky, but rather in all the states of the Union, including Alaska. Indeed, the state of Kentucky has the most favorable conditions for producing bourbon, including the water, the climate, and the know-how of local distillers. Thus, it is unlikely that any other state would be able to produce competitive products. The requirement for bourbon to be aged in new barrels apparently was not so obvious, as it had been fought for at the legislative level for many years. The reasoning why it was so important for the bourbon industry to put this point in the resolution was clear for anyone who understands how business works. By putting this requirement, bourbon distillers made sure that there would be a constant demand for new barrels among bourbon producers. After their use, the barrels can be sold to sherry, Scotch, Irish, and rye whiskey producers, as well as tequila and rum makers, as aging in used barrels is not of high importance for those producers. Thus, one might say that the law created a market for spent barrels, in which both sides are winners. But before bourbon producers could bask in the glory of their achievements, they had to survive a crisis which almost put an end to their business. In January 1920, the production and sale of alcohol became illegal throughout the United States. This prohibition was a disaster for the bourbon producers. Hundreds of distilleries were forced to close within a few months, and thousands of people lost their jobs. All the know-how and skills that were accumulated over many years were locked away. However, there is a catch that makes this story sound too incredible to be true. Namely, because of the loopholes in the law, the bourbon never disappeared from the USA. The law allowed for the production and sale of whiskey, but only for medical purposes, under the strict control of pharmacies. This loophole was enough for several distilleries to survive by continuing to produce their product under state supervision. In fact, the government allowed only 6 distilleries to remain open during the Prohibition period. The doctors prescribed whiskey as medication for almost any illness, from the common cold to neurosis. Among those distilleries that survived the Prohibition, National Distillers was among the most successful. By the time the ban was lifted in 1933, this company had grown to a significant player in the national market and had become one of the pillars of the bourbon revival when the ban was lifted. There is no doubt that this is the law, or rather its loopholes, that saved the bourbon industry from vanishing. The number of bourbon prescriptions during the Prohibition period was so significant that in many ways it influenced the future of the distilleries. Thus, many pharmacies developed as networks of alcohol stores and continued to flourish throughout the Prohibition period. One such chain was Walgreens, which, according to widely accepted theories, was able to expand its network of stores extremely rapidly due to the sale of medicinal liquors, although historians argue about the significance of alcohol in the development of this company. Nevertheless, the creation of this system is another example of how the loopholes in the Prohibition law made whiskey accessible to those who need it. Although the bourbon was saved, the threat to the livelihood of distilleries was far from over, as the events of the following decade show. While American producers struggled to recover from the devastation of the Prohibition period, the next challenge awaited them. This time, the problem was not caused by the U.S. government, but rather the military conflict overseas. When the U.S. entered World War II in 1941, the government was confronted with a shortage of industrial alcohol, which was a crucial ingredient in gunpowder, synthetic rubber, and, most importantly, the recently discovered penicillin. Kentucky's distilleries, capable of producing millions of gallons of high-proof spirits, were the obvious solution. The government simply compelled the majority of bourbon distilleries to cease production and make alcohol for the war effort. The production of the spirit for civilian use was halted for several years. When the war ended and the bourbon distilleries reopened, the supply of aged whiskeys was significantly diminished, and what remained was of a lower quality than the pre-war bourbon. Thus, the historians of the industry point to the late 1940s and early 1950s as a period of decline, which is barely remembered by modern whiskey drinkers. Some distilleries were even forced to switch to the production of synthetic rubber, as the Japanese conquest of Southeast Asia interrupted the supply of natural rubber. For several years, alcohol produced in Kentucky's distilleries was at the forefront of America's war effort, with distillery owners securing government contracts alongside ammunition producers. However, only a handful of independent brands were able to maintain any supply of pre-war whiskey for their most loyal customers. As such, the bottles of the Ayers bourbon whiskey have since become coveted collectibles. The industry soon recovered from the effects of the war, but the next significant event in its history was once again caused not by a war or a government regulation, but by the peculiarities of human psychology. For 2 decades, bourbon has seen a true explosion in popularity, and at the center of this growth has been one whiskey in particular. This particular brand was once only a small product of a family-owned distillery, but its combination of relative scarcity on the market, extreme aging, and demand from a small but devoted group of consumers has given it legendary status. A bottle that only cost $150 when released can frequently fetch up to $5,000 or even $10,000 on the resale market. Because of the product's scarcity, many distilleries that sell the bourbon have to hold lotteries to decide who gets to buy the coveted liquor at the much lower price. The demand for this product has been so high that in 2013, thieves managed to get their hands on several barrels of the bourbon worth over $26,000. This theft, which became known as the Pappy Heist, was still under investigation when those responsible for it were eventually found. The popularity of Pappy Van Winkle has also spawned a market full of forgeries. With many counterfeits appearing on the secondary market, genuine bottles have to be carefully examined for serial numbers and other distinguishing features to ensure that one is not buying a fake. Some restaurants and bars will deliberately buy a single bottle of the bourbon to then advertise it as available for tasting at an inflated price, as regular customers would never be able to afford to buy an entire bottle at the prices of up to several thousands of dollars per bottle. This single brand's popularity has led to an entire industry of speculation, but many other whiskeys follow a similar pattern. Several distilleries that make much more common products employ a strategy of limited releases and artificial scarcity to inflate their products' prices several times higher than usual. It began with pioneers who had no barley and had to make do with the local corn. It was followed by a tax that forced farmers to turn to armed uprising against the government. Then it was Kentucky's limestone filtered water, which was a happy accident before anyone had heard of chemistry. Then it was a legendary preacher and a charred barrel of whiskey whose authenticity will never be known. It was a law that almost killed the industry, and the loophole in that law, pharmacy scripts, that saved it. Then it was a world war and the need for alcohol to make penicillin and smokeless powder. Finally, it was the cult of scarcity, which turned a common bottle of whiskey into an object of 5-figure secondary market prices. It always seemed as if the industry would meet the insurmountable challenge and find a way through it. Sometimes it happened literally, as it did when the war broke out and whiskey distillers had to switch to industrial alcohol. Sometimes it happened symbolically, as it did when a fictional Elijah Craig claimed to have charred his first barrel. when there is no way to distinguish that claim from the multitude of similar claims made by dozens of other distillers. In all cases, the industry overcame the challenge, either by adapting its production, as it did during the war, or by symbolically adopting a new and better version of itself. Even the cult of scarcity, the final obstacle in the bourbon's development, was also a way of overcoming obstacles, albeit on a symbolic level. It happened because the producers felt that the product was not valuable enough to be allowed to deteriorate. Thus, precisely in response to the threat of disappearance, bourbon was given a new lease of life, a new opportunity to prove its worth. So, the next time you pour yourself a drink, you will know that you are not just enjoying a drink, but also participating in the history of the industry that has fought 3 near-fatal accidents.